$26 trillion. That's how much wealth is hidden in tax havens. Okay, I'll be honest, that's just a guess. We can't know how much money is in there. It's at least $20 trillion, but that $20 trillion slips around, goes through shell companies and secret bank accounts, making it very hard to track. In this video, I'll try to map how taxes are avoided by the largest corporations, where they go, and how it flows through the tax haven system to create this massive multi-trillion-dollar financial web.
Subscribe.
Everyone has a different answer for what the largest haven is. Is it the British Virgin Islands, Hong Kong, Ireland, or America? By some metrics, there are even up to 100 tax havens on Earth. In general, we can sort these into 3 categories, each adding something unique to the web: the shell cities, the profit pushers, and the money pilers. We're going to go through each of these categories, only looking at the most egregious examples to see how countries, governments, and wealthy corporations can benefit themselves by being part of this web, all while making your tax bill higher.
You go to Shell City?
First, let's look at the shell cities, the most potent and important part of tax restructuring, as we at the Bureau like to say. The majority of shells used for evasion and money laundering have always been found in the Caribbean, the island banks. But what even is a shell? Well, it's just a sub-company that the parent company owns 100% of, more often than not in a secrecy jurisdiction. You can then transfer assets or profits to the shell despite the fact that it just sits there, only existing on paper without any real operations. If the shell is registered in a country with no corporate tax, well, it doesn't pay tax then. And it works best with many layers too. A shell within a shell within a shell within a shell makes it just a headache to look into. You think you find out who the owner of a Panamanian shell company is after months of digging and find out, oh, it's a nameless Cayman shell company as well. Great. 2 countries had originally dived into this strategy before it became a region-wide phenomenon: Panama and the Bahamas. Panama had originally been more of a shipping haven, owing to the fact that it was by far the most important country for American shipping when the canal opened in 1914. Just 5 years later, they allowed the Standard Oil Company of New York to register under the Panamanian flag to avoid Uncle Sam's Seaman Act, later letting other shippers register here to avoid the same seamen. By the 1920s, however, they expanded this low-tax, leniently regulated, and highly secretive regime into finance, aided by many Wall Street lawyers who drafted legislation for the government. And here, we can already see 2 very common features of the spiderweb. One is that secrecy, anonymity, and general financial opaqueness is the most important part in attracting offshore cash. The second is the army of lawyers which are drafted in from either New York or more often London to create these laws for the small havens. The corporate secrecy laws are so secretive in Panama that spilling the tea over who owns which offshore trust can result in a fine of $50,000 or 6 months in prison. It was also here almost 100 years after its first ship registry when tax havens got their worst PR ever, when the Panama Papers, a collection of 1.5 million files, were exposed to the world. 214,000 shell companies were found to be set up by Mossack Fonseca, what was an integral law firm in Panama's modern financial system. These papers showed how, like never before, billionaires, world leaders, and celebrities exploited the global tax system, certainly moving the public needle at least a little backwards on our financial interconnectedness. The other pioneer, the Bahamas, was originally more of a rum haven during America's Prohibition years. But after America let loose, they lost this business, and a poor sponging and tourism economy was left in its wake. The 1930s then saw one of the highest tax hikes in American history, and suddenly the reason for visiting these islands changed from boozing up to suiting up. Many famous and wealthy Americans had gone there to make shell companies of their own. London-based lawyers were even the first to conceive that many corporations could exist all in one building here. Since it was a Bahamian law at the time to display a nameplate on the front of the building, many offices would be covered from the ground to the roof with corporate names. Something echoed even today with places like Ugland House in the Cayman Islands holding up to 40,000 companies inside of it, which gave it a pretty sad 2.8 star review on Google Maps. Are they tax dodging cheats or is taxation theft? I don't know. This guy just said Sunday. So when the British Empire collapsed in the 60s and 70s, even the Bahamas declared independence. Its tiny overseas territories, which were much too small to go at it alone, did what worked best for those other small British islands. They copied the model word for word into their law. None did it better than this triangle, bounded by Bermuda in the north, the Cayman Islands to the west, and the British Virgin Islands to the east. Because money and banks between these three islands are so interconnected, many people treat it as one massive tax haven, creating the true Bermuda Triangle. Money flows in, and then you don't really know where it goes next, because it comes out held by an anonymous shell company. Incorporation fees now make up most of the budgets of the triangle, all being attractive places for having no corporate tax, a high amount of secrecy, the speed and low cost of incorporation, and being part of the UK, which holds a large network of tax treaties. Tax treaties are another important part of our web. They're basically just an agreement between two countries so that if any sort of cross-border economic activity happens, the person or company doing that can avoid paying taxes twice. Working there, investing there, or bringing money in from another country, those sorts of things. Exploiting loopholes in tax treaty networks is key to sending money across the world for free. There are around 3,000 of these treaties worldwide, with the UK alone having over 120 of them, giving you plenty of combos to test. This really took off for the Triangle when America and Britain signed their own tax treaty, shifting money to these islands rather than the Dutch Antilles which many companies used before. But because these are such small islands whose economic strategies rely on a race to the bottom of the tax barrel, they've tried to diversify, at least a little. Considering the cottage industries of lawyers, accountants, and money managers already built up, diversification here means more finance. The Cayman Islands are the #1 spot on Earth to manage a hedge fund from. The Virgin Islands are the #1 spot to park a trust. And Bermuda is a global hub for insurers and reinsurers, but for some reason got scared at the lucrative prospect of reinsurance. This island also has the highest tariff rate on Earth to make up for the lack of a normal income tax. And Bermuda has certainly gone the farthest in the triangle. Starting in 2025, they now impose a 15% corporate tax on foreign companies, but only if they make almost $1 billion a year. As for the Bahamas, they've specialized in cutting-edge finance, making the world's first digital currency, the sand dollar, and hosting large crypto companies, which saw its reputation hurt when the Bahamas' own FTX was exposed to be a massive fraud. China in particular loves these shells. In fact, it's estimated that up to half of all incorporations worldwide are just from Chinese people setting up shells in the Caymans and British Virgin Islands. This boomed in the years leading up to Hong Kong's transfer to China, when wealthy mainlanders wanted to get their money out for fear and confusion of what this new political regime would be. The amount transferred got so much that the Virgin Islands had to set up a Chinese language service for registering companies. Shells play a key role for wealthy Chinese people, locked out of more traditional financial markets because of the Chinese Communist Party's stringent controls on cross-border money flows. However, China, the great engineering state that it is, has many less restrictions for foreign investment, sometimes offering tax incentives, like most recently offering a 10% credit for foreigners who reinvest into China to write off from their taxes. A Chinese government report of the top 15 foreign investors into the country in 2023 includes Macau, Samoa, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Singapore, and by far the largest, Hong Kong, which still is a massive place to park cash and reinvest into China despite the political fears. Now I'm sorry to the Virgin Islanders. I love all of you, you get your money up and I see that. But there is no chance you guys are the third largest investors into the mighty Chinese economy. It is absolutely wealthy Chinese investors setting up shells here to smuggle their money back into China. For one reason, because it's illegal for Chinese citizens to own shares in strategic industries like tech, large tech companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu raise a majority of their capital through offshore investors. And even some Chinese state-owned firms like Sinopec and the State Grid actually issue bonds using these Caribbean shells. To China, this web is more than a way to avoid your government. Well, it is, but it may be the primary way to invest into your own country's assets. Now, one thing you might notice throughout this video is that the bulk of successful offshore financial hubs have been or still are British colonies. And I know, that's just because the bulk of countries were British colonies. But here we're talking about very small outposts of the British Empire, on small islands or cities on the coast, or more small islands. There are a lot of islands in this system, and this is not coincidental. The offshore system has always been centered around two cities, London and its sister, New York. London lawyers, with their good friends Wall Street financiers and lawyers, have been instrumental in crafting the tax codes for their islands, whose frameworks were often built when the colony was still part of the British Empire. Of course, they were pushed by the banks and financial sectors of the two historical global hubs of finance. The lawyers would then export the model or build a complementary model to other islands, all running on English common law. Maybe the most landmark decision in making this was, pardon my legalese, Egyptian Delta Land and Investment Company Limited versus Todd, when it was ruled that a British company could incorporate in Britain, but as long as they don't make profits there, not pay British tax. That was in 1929. Just before we saw the British Bahamas make a framework to attract wealthy Americans. We then saw it exported to the Bermuda Triangle, but these models have sprung up in less successful financial hubs as well. Bahrain's British model was exported to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Norfolk Islands model, which was made under Australian law, was exported to many different Pacific Island nations. And a New York law firm, Shearman and Sterling, which set up the International Business Corporations Act in the British Virgin Islands, later copied it word for word into Anguilla, Belize, and even back to the Bahamas. In most cases, it was London or New York who came first, and a wave of emulation after.
We should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else!
Which brings us to the next specialty of the network, pushing profits across the world. Unlike shells, which work best in countries which respect anonymity, profit pushers don't mind being seen. In fact, the larger the tax treaty network and the more the country interacts with the outside world, the better you can push profits through it to a shell hub. And I'll say now, all of the best profit pushers are in Europe, and more than that, in the European Union. The best three are Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and by far and away the best profit pusher on earth, Ireland. Now, there are many tools to do this. Most rely on three methods: using debt, transfer pricing, and most importantly, intellectual property. These are called base erosion and profit shifting methods, BEPS or BEPS tools. Get it? You shift profit and erode your tax base in the process? One tool may be to take out a loan in one country and deduct its interest from your taxes in another. But the biggest are patent boxes. Many countries offer lower taxes for profits made from innovation or patents. In reality, large companies just transfer a share of their profits to these other countries and say the patent is held there. How much of the profit? Get creative with it. Can you really prove what percentage of value this iPhone or these Nike kicks made from its brand name, patent, or designs? In 2016, Ireland's Central Statistics Office shocked the world. They had just added up the 2015 GDP numbers, revealing a growth rate of 26.3% throughout the year. That's right, the Irish were a quarter richer in just 1 year. They basked in their glory. Each Irishman hopped in their pot of gold, and Apple tried to shift to the side, out of frame, so as not to attract any attention. Yes, this leprechaun economics was pretty much only the result of Apple when it shifted roughly 300 billion euros to the island through a BEPS tool called the Capital Allowance for Intangible Assets. So no, Ireland did not suddenly grow a quarter richer. In fact, their GDP statistics are so permanently broken by this and other transfers that Irish leaders don't even use it anymore, opting to use other, more realistic measures of productivity. Apple has actually been in trouble in Ireland before for using the double Irish with a Dutch sandwich tool to avoid US taxes. That sounds dumb, but I promise it was a real thing. An American company would register 2 Irish subsidiary companies. This one would get IP rights over patents or some intangible asset and lease it to the second Irish company, which would pay it back royalties. The first Irish company would be managed from Bermuda, which would exempt it from Irish taxes. The second company would make the profits through the IP, then transfer the royalties through a Dutch holding company, taking advantage of the taxless cross-border payments between the countries. Thus, a double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. This was by far the largest tax avoidance tool American companies used in its history. Starting in the 80s, it shielded them hundreds of billions of dollars a year. However, as of 2015's big reveal, the government started phasing it out, with the double Irish with the Dutch sandwich officially dead in 2020. The European Court of Justice ordered Apple to pay 13 billion euros to Ireland for avoiding 23 years of taxes. You don't mess with the European lion. They might waste thousands of years of human life in an endless bureaucratic struggle to reclaim what's rightfully theirs. The Irish government actually appealed this, but it was overturned by the EU. They argued that Apple shouldn't have had to pay this and that the 13 billion euros lost was more than made up for by the number of foreign companies they had attracted. Now, almost a third of the government's revenue is made up of the tax these massive companies pay. And 12% of Irish workers, or around 300,000 people, now work for a foreign tech company. Although the corporate tax in Ireland isn't crazy low at 12.5%, in 2015 they started a patent box to cut that in half, so only 6.25%. And effectively even lower when you consider the transfer pricing shenanigans most firms get into. So now, even more than ever, American companies use Irish subsidiaries. By 2023, around 70% of pre-tax income generated by American companies are from companies with at least 2 Irish subsidiaries, as compared to about 40% at the start of the 21st century. Now, to be fair to Ireland, this strategy isn't a shell industry like we saw before. There are real effects this has had for the Irish people. Some quite polarizing effects, but still real.
We're all here because we know that the housing crisis is a catastrophe.
Ireland in the 1930s and 40s was quite poor, protectionist, nationalist, and fearful of foreign money. In the words of Barry Eichengreen, anti-growth ideology was pervasive. The government even resisted investing in telephone lines and roads on the grounds that these were mere conveniences for the rich. This was the context when in the 50s, they started their transformation into the free-flowing capital hub they are today. First was this white paper by T.K. Whitaker, a highly influential public servant which argued that the solution to Ireland's constant struggles was to grow, 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 as fast as she can. A new generation of Irish politicians were swept up in the ideas of market freedom over everything. Rather than the status quo, a Catholic, rural, almost degrowth mindset. Then came the Shannon Free Zone, the world's first free trade zone, fit with low taxes, little regulations, and full of loopholes to exploit. The 80s saw the biggest boom into foreign money, joining the single European market, creating the Irish Financial Services Centre, basically Shannon for finance, and trying to attract all this freed up money from London after Margaret Thatcher's own deregulation programs. The realest and rawest effect all this money had was fueling the country's housing bubble, eventually popping during Europe's debt crisis. Irish relative housing prices increased more than 3 times America's did before crashing, resulting in what some see in the decades after as a hollowed out, expensive economy only fit for attracting foreign companies. Of course, there are more profit pushers. They pop up every now and then. Hungary stands out as a country trying to aggressively push into this market. But more likely than not, new profit pushers will pop up inside of Europe, whose countries can take advantage of the free flow of capital across European borders and banks, and whose countries have the largest tax treaty networks on Earth.
Hello, I like money.
But once you've made that money, by shifting it through one of the green countries here into a blue shell haven, it's not safe. Transferring it back into the US, UK, or your home country would likely be taxed as income and all your hard work would be for nothing. No, you have to throw it in a money pile. Keep it outside of your country. From your shells, you can still invest in global assets and even put it in offshore bank accounts. And by far, your best 3 options, in fact, the only 3 countries to have offshore bank assets worth over $1 trillion each, are Switzerland, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Switzerland came first, finding out that its neutrality and political stability made it very attractive after the First World War, which destroyed Europeans' trust in each other, but more importantly, trust in themselves. Switzerland is a very decentralized country, so the first to try to attract foreign money were individual cantons, namely Zug and Zurich, as well as independent Liechtenstein to create the OG triangle of secrecy. It's also a very conservative country, whose traditionalist leaders reassured Europe's elite that their money won't be gobbled up by the rising left-wing movements across the continent. By the 1920s, Switzerland was rivaling France as Europe's banking hub, mainly with French and German capital, the 2 countries most uneasy at the time. Swiss prudence reassured German and Austrian investors during their bouts of hyperinflation, and acted as a safe haven to store assets during the Nazi regime. In fact, to protect their clients from the Nazis who wanted to expropriate gold and cash from fleeing Jewish refugees, they enacted a very strict banking secrecy law, making it a criminal offense to divulge information about a banking client. They, of course, used this law to take Nazi gold as well, billions of dollars of it still existing in Switzerland today. And that secrecy has made them the financial hub they are. While they're not necessarily a corporate tax haven, their tax rate ranges from 12 to 20%, they will take untaxed money to the bank, no questions asked. Infamously, even setting up accounts for the worst dictators from world history. You know, Trujillo Batista the Perons, Gaddafi Mubarak Abacha, Mobutu Obiang, and Baby Doc. Switzerland's place as the banking hub has been replaced since the financial crisis, however. Now, with more and more rich Asians than ever before, it makes sense that the 2 largest money piles would be found in Asia's own free zones. Singapore and Hong Kong collectively make up almost half of all offshore banking assets. Both of them used a policy of attracting as many foreign banks as possible to their cities in order to build up their foreign capital, then swallowed them up to create massive economies of scale in their super banks. Singapore's big break was with capital flight from the French Indochina War in the 60s. That was the decade of their independence, and when they had created the Development Bank of Singapore to be the financing arm of their industrial policy. By now, with their 1990s consolidatory Pac-Man strategy, banks eating banks, DBS has grown into the largest bank in Southeast Asia, and Singapore's total offshore banking assets have multiplied by more than 10 times since 2000. Wow. Hong Kong was always going to be a bit more complicated. It was taken by the UK in the Opium War with China, eventually agreed to only be leased to the British for 99 years in 1898. That ran out, and the city is technically Chinese now, but with a substantial amount of autonomy, at least for now. By far their biggest success was their first homegrown bank, HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They ate Midland Bank, then the Republic New York Bank, then Hang Seng Bank. You get the idea. They gobbled up a lot of banks. Even today, HSBC accounts for half of all Hong Kong's banking transactions. They could alone rival Singapore as an offshore haven. So, in a way, you could really say these three countries are the world's truest tax havens, in that they're the haven part you'd be more likely to think of when you're trying to dodge the tax man. They're not really where you save on taxes. That's pushed through Europe and docked into shells in the Caribbean. But it's where you stash it when all that's done. Some other money piles you might consider are Macau, the Isle of Man, Jersey, Monaco, or even some others we've covered like Panama, the Caymans, or Luxembourg. Or, of course, stashed into housing in New York, London, or Dubai. A 2013 investigation found that half of One Hyde Park's apartments, the most expensive property on Earth, were owned by anonymous Virgin Island corporations. Most famously, Russian oligarchs and elites have used shells in Cyprus, connecting them to Virgin Island shells to invest their money into these global cities. Up to 3/4 of the country's wealth may have even come from Russian shells. And Cypriot companies have been found to be investors in some of Russia's geopolitical interests. Syrian chemical weapons manufacturers, and Hezbollah bank accounts, to name a few. However, with the imposition of EU sanctions and Cyprus being a kind of begrudging part of the EU, nowadays it may be the Turkish-occupied northern Cyprus which now benefits from Russian money, with more and more Russians living in the north, spending time in the new beachside boomtowns of this breakaway state. So I hope it's clear by now with this growing web that tax havens are very much a product of a globalized world, and it would simply be impossible to target a single island to destroy the whole system. The biggest growth to the web was in the 1990s, when the entire world now agreed that the rights to profit were something you could buy and sell, capitalism, rather than inherent to the workers which produced it, and thus could be exported around the world. So the 1990s saw the biggest efforts to combat this behemoth, and most efforts failed, yes. But then the financial crisis happened, and now we're all going to get together to solve it. Okay, it didn't happen again. But then COVID happened, and it finally seemed like the world had it solved, with the globalistly named OECD/G20 Inclusive Framework on BEPS, with the core policy being a minimum corporate income tax of 15% on companies with almost $1 billion in revenue. Almost 150 countries signed it, and one of them, absolutely, certainly, was the United States. Good. I was worried about them. The Economist had even predicted the end of the tax haven now. So why do we even have to fret if the world's multinational hubs signed it? Oh, they pulled out. Okay. And in 2026, the inclusive framework was actually updated to exclude American multinationals from the 15% minimum tax rule, which could now make American subsidiaries the next hot thing if implementation actually goes through. The ironic part is, America kind of already is the world's largest tax haven. Yes, the official corporate tax rate is already more than the 15% minimum they gracefully avoided their companies paying, at 21%. However, there are 50 states in this here union, count the stars, and each of them has their own tax codes. An American company can choose to incorporate in whichever state it wants, so some have really given them incentive to choose theirs. This practice goes all the way back to the 19th century, when New Jersey and Delaware offered competitive advantages to incorporate in the Garden or First States. But when Woodrow Wilson, yes, that Woodrow Wilson, became governor of New Jersey on an anti-corruption platform, he straightened up their corporate law a little, and only little Delaware was left as an incorporation hub in the US. Of course, as time went on, Delaware became more and more corporate friendly, drafting in New York lawyers to write business-friendly acts for them. For $1,500, you can now set up a Delaware corporation in 30 minutes online. The Secretary of State even stays open until midnight on weekdays so that you, yes you, can incorporate at practically any time you want. Now, for a population of less than 1 million people, Delaware holds over 2 million companies, including 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies. Like Amazon, Alphabet, Walmart, Tesla was here, not anymore. Delaware's real specialty is their world-class corporate law sector. Only the most cutting-edge corporate lawyers can be found in the Garden State. Delaware's Court of Chancery for Corporate Law and its Corporation Law Council have an immense amount of power over the rest of the US, since whatever happens in Delaware basically affects all of America's businesses. For example, because 4 of the largest credit card companies are incorporated in Delaware, and Delaware ruled back in the 80s that credit cards are not subject to interest rate caps, that basically meant all of American consumers would no longer have an interest cap were they not to pay their credit card bill. Some of their secrecy was only eroded in 2020, when the names of shareholders holding over 25% of the company had to be made public thanks to the Federal Corporate Transparency Act. Made in part because Delaware has had some pretty bad names pop up in past investigations. Ramon Fonseca of Panama Papers fame, Najib Razak, who as Malaysian Prime Minister stole billions of dollars of public money, and Victor Bout, the Merchant of Death, all at one time holding Delaware Incorporated shells. But of course, Delaware offers its very own tax incentives as well. Many do it with property and debt loopholes, but the biggest is a classic IP-BEPS tool, the Delaware loophole. For example, Home Depot once registered a Delaware subsidiary company named Homer Depot, whose only products were the mascot Homer Depot and trademarks, where low prices are just the beginning. Under Delaware law, revenue generated by intangibles like these are not taxed as long as the store isn't in Delaware, while the parent company gets to write off what it spent for these as a business expense. In 2000, Homer Depot had 4 employees but technically generated $2 billion in revenue. That's $500 million per worker. They might be the most productive on Earth. Toys R Us did this with Jeffrey Limited for Jeffrey the Giraffe, and WorldCom has even done this, arguing that a Delaware subsidiary owned their management foresight. Who's to say it didn't? So with all these write-offs, the average firm is able to save $3 to $4 million in taxes thanks to Delaware's abusive tax code. It might not save you as much as setting up shells in the islands, but Delaware certainly has a better reputation than the Cayman Islands. And you can keep your money in the American system to invest here if needed. If you used a Cayman shell, you'd either have to tax its entry or store it in Singapore. So with that, I think we've completed enough of the map for you to get a picture of the absolute monstrosity that is the offshore financial system. It's a system which benefits the most well-off, small corporate captured governments, and criminals at the average person's expense. There's no telling how many people, companies, and dollars are a part of it. That's its beauty. Everyone knows it exists, but it's still hidden from the public. Frankly, the more complicated it is, the better it works, as lawyers can find new loopholes in the ever-growing Byzantine tax systems of the world. The less complex a tax system is, the less power the tax haven network has. Just saying, if anyone's up for tax reform, make it simpler, not more complicated. It's an issue that really should cut across the political spectrum everywhere on Earth. Obviously, a government losing up to a quarter of its potential tax base will A. cut services it could provide, and B. strain the government so much to put it at the risk of rising debt, default, or in some more extreme cases, corruption and rent-seeking. All of those make a more inefficient government, which nobody wants, except those who can move faster than it.
Subscribe.